Okay, let's dive right into this. Welcome to today's Explainer. We're going to unpack one of the most, if not the most, terrifying events in human history, the Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962. But, we aren't just going to look at the broad strokes here. We're going inside the room. We're going to look exactly at how a small, totally exhausted group of advisors, known as the Executive Committee, or EXCOM for short, managed to navigate a grueling 13-day nuclear crisis. I mean, they literally held the fate of the planet in their hands. I want you to ask yourself a terrifying question. What if the world had only been hours away from total nuclear war? Just really think about that for a second. We're talking about a moment in time when the stakes were absolutely, undeniably apocalyptic. Every single decision, every agonizing delay, every misunderstood message debated by EXCOM, it all had the potential to end civilization as we know it. This wasn't some hypothetical drill, right? This was a living, breathing nightmare, unfolding in real time. And this brilliantly illustrates the central contradiction that made things so uniquely dangerous. On one side, you've got these massive global superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. Both are armed to the teeth with nuclear weapons, capable of just wiping each other out from across the globe. But the catalyst for this ultimate showdown, it wasn't some distant battlefield halfway across the world. It was a geographic nightmare. Cuba is an island, right there, roughly 90 miles from the coast of Florida. That terrifying proximity meant that EXCOM would have essentially 0 minutes to react to a nuclear launch. Literally no time at all. Now, as you probably know, this whole thing didn't just happen in a vacuum. Let's backtrack slightly. Back in 1959, the Cuban Revolution brought Fidel Castro to power. That eventually culminated in the failed US-backed Bay of Pigs invasion in April 1961, which, as you might guess, pushed Castro much closer to the Soviet Union. So Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev makes a huge move. He decides to secretly deploy nuclear-capable missiles to Cuba. But keep in mind, the US already had Jupiter nuclear missiles stationed in Turkey and Italy sitting right on the Soviet border. So EXCOM wasn't starting with a clean slate here. They were inheriting an already deeply fractured, highly tense geopolitical chessboard. Okay, so the ticking clock truly starts on day one, October 14th, 1962. A high-altitude American U-2 reconnaissance aircraft snaps some photographs of the ground over Cuba. Now think about how low-tech this was compared to today. Intelligence analysts were literally hunched over, using magnifying glasses to stare at the shadows of tents and dirt roads. But those shadows suddenly became undeniable, hard evidence of Soviet missile sites under construction. This completely abrupt, shocking discovery is exactly what forced the immediate creation of EXCOM. Now, what's really interesting here is what happens next. On October 16th, day 3 of the crisis, President John F. Kennedy is briefed on these photos, and he knew instantly he couldn't just trust his own instincts alone for something this massive. So he locked his smartest and honestly most conflicting advisors in a room together. He formed the Executive Committee of the National Security Council and basically told them, figure it out. For the next 2 weeks, the immense, crushing weight of navigating this puzzle fell entirely on EXCOM's shoulders. I want you to try and put yourself right there in EXCOM's shoes. You're staring down this terrifying menu of choices, and honestly, every single one feels like it could be a fatal mistake. Look at this. If you do nothing, a nuclear threat just sits there, 90 miles from Florida. Diplomatic pressure might be way too slow. A conventional military attack, well, it might miss some active missiles and trigger immediate retaliation. Inside that boardroom, the arguments were bitter. Military hawks were pounding the table for airstrikes and a full invasion, while diplomatic doves warned that would absolutely spark World War III. It was just an impossible, agonizing debate. So imagine the sheer anxiety of day 9, October 22nd. After days of these incredibly intense, top-secret debates, EXCOM had finally hammered out a plan, and it was time to reveal the secret burden to the world. President Kennedy went on television and addressed the American public. He exposed the offensive missile sites to the globe and announced their chosen response, a naval quarantine around Cuba. In an instant, those claustrophobic secret meetings were over, and the public standoff was officially on. Now notice the specific word EXCOM chose to use here, quarantine. They went back and forth on this endlessly. They deliberately avoided the term blockade, and here's why that is so brilliant. Under international law, a blockade is technically an official act of war. By framing it as a quarantine, defining it as a naval operation strictly to prevent additional military equipment from reaching Cuba, EXCOM executed this masterful piece of legal semantics. It was really their first major victory. threading a very delicate legal needle just to buy the world a few more precious hours for diplomacy to actually work. But, as we know, a speech doesn't physically stop a cargo ship. So the whole world just held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Soviet ships loaded with supplies were already steaming toward the quarantine area. And to make matters worse, Soviet leadership initially flat-out rejected the American demands. So the ultimate nail-biting question was just hanging in the air. Would the Soviet ships cross the line and force a military confrontation, or would they blink and turn around? While the public was glued to the situation with the naval ships, behind the scenes, XCOM was dealing with an absolute nightmare of imperfect communications. I mean, think about this. XCOM was trying to prevent a nuclear apocalypse using a system that basically functioned at the speed of a telegraph. A single message from Khrushchev could take over 12 hours to be drafted, transmitted, translated, and finally decoded in Washington. By the time XCOM was analyzing one harsh, demanding letter, they might suddenly receive a second, much softer letter. It left them psychologically tortured, constantly trying to decipher what Khrushchev's true intent actually was. Let's move to day 14 and see how this builds, because all this confusion culminated on October 27, 1962, known as Black Saturday. This day is absolutely infamous in history. It's widely considered the single most dangerous moment of the entire crisis. It was a terrifying 24-hour period where the illusion of control just violently slipped right out of the hands of both XCOM and the Soviet leadership. Chaos completely took over the skies on Black Saturday. First, an American U-2 aircraft was shot down over Cuba, tragically killing the pilot, Major Rudolph Anderson Jr. Then, completely by accident, another U-2 aircraft strayed right into Soviet airspace over the Arctic. Talk about bad timing. With American blood now spilled, XCOM found themselves desperately trying to hold back furious U.S. military generals who were demanding immediate, overwhelming retaliation. XCOMs and Kennedy were barely holding the line to prevent an all-out war. And here is the truly terrifying irony of the whole thing. While XCOM was agonizing over diplomatic semantics and fighting with generals in Washington, the actual fate of the world was being decided deep underwater. Right near the quarantine line, an exhausted, sweltering Soviet submarine crew on the B-59 had completely lost communication with Moscow. American naval forces started dropping signaling depth charges to force them up to the surface. But this isolated Soviet crew, they had no idea if World War III had already started up there, and worse, they were carrying a nuclear-armed torpedo, which required the agreement of multiple senior officers on board to launch. Just try to imagine the pressure on this one man, Vasily Arkhipov. While other officers on that submarine genuinely believed they were under attack and were ready to authorize a nuclear strike, Arkhipov firmly opposed it. Sitting in a claustrophobic, overheating submarine, he literally broke the chain of escalation. And what's truly wild about this crucial piece of the puzzle is that XCOM was completely blind to this near mess. They had absolutely no idea this intense underwater drama even happened until long after the crisis was over. Finally, XCOM's grueling 13-day marathon paid off. On day 15, October 28th, a resolution was reached. The immediate crisis was over, and it certainly didn't happen by accident. It was a carefully negotiated mix of military pressure and exhaustive, round-the-clock private diplomacy. Ultimately, XCOM brilliantly crafted an off-ramp. They found a way that allowed both Kennedy and Khrushchev to step back from the edge of the cliff without either of them losing face. So, the crucial point is how they managed this dual reality. It was XCOM's absolute masterstroke. Publicly, it looked like a total clean American victory, right? The Soviets publicly agreed to remove their missiles, and the U.S. merely promised not to invade Cuba. But privately, that public strength masked a massive compromise. The United States secretly agreed to remove its older Jupiter missiles from Turkey at a later date. XCOM kept this Turkish missile trade completely under wraps so they wouldn't appear to be rewarding Soviet aggression, all while quietly securing world peace. The sheer trauma XCOM endured over these 13 days fundamentally changed the world forever. Both sides walked away acutely recognizing just how close human error and agonizingly slow communication had brought them to killing everyone on Earth. That realization led directly to the creation of the Moscow-Washington hotline in 1963. They literally hardwired a direct communication link between the two powers to ensure a 13-day scenario like this never happened again. It also paved the way for the Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, marking a massive, badly needed shift in how global superpowers manage their deadly arsenals. So, what does this all mean for us today? It leaves us with one crucial, enduring question to ponder. Why can nuclear crises become incredibly dangerous even when neither side actually wants a war? The story of how XCOM navigated those 13 days shows us that the real enemy isn't always the other side's malicious intent. Sometimes, the most lethal threats to humanity are miscalculation, fear, incomplete information, and the sheer, uncontrollable momentum of military escalation. It's a profound lesson from history. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the history that shapes our world.